Welcome back. This is week 12, lecture 1. And here we continue our discussion of various patterns of the Reformation, which I'll be saying a bit more about shortly, in terms of what constitutes a pattern and those such things. And because we just finished with Calvin and what can be seen as the Reformation of the refugees as a distinct pattern. And again, I'll be talking a bit more about these so-called patterns um, very shortly. But the Radical Reformation is yet another pattern. And that we'll be talking about in this lecture, and then in the following lecture, week 12, lecture 2, I'll be talking about the English Reformation, the Reformation of England, um, which actually fits in. I mean, it's definitely a kind of a unique case, but it rather fits in what's called the Magisterial Reformation, but I'll talk about that before. Now, these patterns of Reformation are, once again, they're categories of how historians have attempted to trace and analyze and deal with the various manifestations of, let's say, opposition to the Roman hierarchy in its most basic form. I will be using the term Protestant, probably. Whether by design or not, because it's a useful term. But I want you to remember that technically there were no Protestants at all, really, until 1529, with the protesting princes walking out of the Second Deed of Speyer, when they were called the Protestant princes. But we can look at it in a broader sense, a less technical historical sense, as Protestants referring to any protest against the hierarchy in Rome. We need to distinguish that from opposition to particular doctrines or practices of Rome. There have been critiques of the church all along, and that does not mean that they were Protestant. That's why I've argued that Luther's, when he posted his 95 Theses, that's not the beginning of his Reformation. That's not the beginning of his Protestant stance, because he's doing so as a faithful member of the Holy Mother Church, in his own words. And so there's that critique from within the structure of the traditional hierarchy, ecclesiastical hierarchy that formed that one part power, dual power uh, loci, or locuses, two sources of power: the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy, or the spiritual and temporal and everything else. But it's one thing to do that from within, and another to protest the very structure itself. I mean, we can think of it in terms of politics in the United States. It's fine to critique the government. People have critiqued the government all along. That's different from seeking to overthrow the government or to succeed from the government and establish something new. Now, if that analogy helps, great. But what I want to stress is that it is completely ahistorical, and theologically dubious too. But that was, I would argue, but that's another issue. But it's completely ahistorical to look at critiques of the church as Protestant. I mean, Marsilius of Padua, in his Defensor Pacis, published in 1324, where he calls for the abolition of the papacy, we might say is proto-Protestant, we could almost say. But that would be very much misunderstanding what Marsilius was about in his context, as well as what the later quote-unquote Protestant movements were about. Because Marsilius did not critique um, theologically some of the positions. It was the structure. So when we have kind of this critique of the structure together with the theological critique, that is within a political context, and that those three elements, the critique of the structure, critique of the theology, and a political context for doing so, is what basically constitutes being a Protestant in that sense. So we can't just see that every time someone is critical or criticizing the church or even calling the Pope the Antichrist, that is Protestant or proto-Protestant. There was constant critique, constant kind of opposition, but from within. When that break is made, that is a very different approach because then it is saying, we are leaving and we are critiquing the entire structure. And I've also pointed out that Luther kind of established and basically all the mainline Protestant traditions in the 16th century, which again I'll be talking a bit more about shortly, established their own hierarchy in terms of authority and power. So essentially, they were replacing um, the old hierarchy that culminated in the Pope with a new hierarchy that for Luther culminated in Luther. And then after Luther's time, as I'll be talking about in a later lecture, there began to be once again a power vacuum, so to speak. And how do we deal with the continuance of the Lutheran tradition after Luther dies? And we have another split, basically. But that's a later story. So that's what I want to kind of point out and get to, that the term Protestant has a very precise meaning in terms of originally those protesting princes against the decree of the emperor, the Edict of Worms, enforcing the Edict of Worms. No, we protest, we leave, we're being Protestants. That is different from saying that there's a lot of problems in the church, the doctrines are wrong, the teaching is wrong, the Pope is going crazy. Um, Augustinus of Ancona, going back to the 14th century, in his Summa de Ecclesiastica Potestate, argued that there certainly were bad popes. Often there are bad popes. Not every pope is a bad pope, but there are bad popes. But a bad pope still must be obeyed unless he advocates for heresy. I mean, that's if he's an open heretic, then you don't obey an open heretic. But that is the other line. There is a very fine line at times between what is acceptable and the wide spectrum of possible positions within that spectrum, and then going beyond the pale, so to speak. And it's not always clear where that line is drawn. And it can be drawn at different places at different times, depending on power structures and who's involved and the political situation at the time. But in the more general sense, then Protestant we can use for, as I think I just said, where we find opposition and rejection of the established structures of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, combined with a critique and rejection of the traditional theological positions, which again, there was a wide spectrum, and having a political context for doing so. Now, the term radical reformation, as I think I've then going back to what I began with in terms of the origins of these terms, as the terms I'll be talking about shortly too, talking about the different patterns of the Reformation, what constitutes a pattern, are historiographical terms. They're terms that historians have used to categorize and label and group together the various manifestations of Protestant movements based on that opposition from outside, moving outside critique of the whole structure. If that makes sense. If it doesn't, please write and ask me to clarify, or think more about it, review what I've been saying, and maybe hopefully too by the time this lecture is over, and maybe a bit clearer too as well. So that's being said, we can then move on to talking about this pattern of Reformation that has been labeled the Radical Reformation. The title itself and the concept of the Radical Reformation as type or pattern of Reformation is that of George Huntston Williams, who in 1962 published his classic work that's still a standard. Even though so much work has been done since then, it's still not been surpassed. But George Huntston Williams published his book, The Radical Reformation, in 1962. It's a very thick, fat book. I have a copy in my office. A brilliant work. And so that this term comes from him. And just as it'll be next week when we talk about the Catholic or Counter Reformation, how we label these various manifestations, these various categories of Reformation movements, goes a long way to influencing how we understand them and view them. Just as the kind of the terms, the Counter Reformation, or was it a Catholic Reformation, or was it early modern Catholicism? I'll be talking more about that next week. But here, the term, the Radical Reformation, is not a thing in itself. And one of the things that Williams demonstrated and elaborated on within his big fat book was the wide variety of movements that he grouped together within the term the Radical Reformation. It's more diverse in some ways than any other pattern of Reformation. But we'll talk more about that too momentarily. So that's kind of the introductory prefatory comments that now have gone on far longer than planned, kind of as always, in terms of approaching this term, approaching what constitutes being part of a radical Reformation as opposed to Luther's Reformation or Calvin's Reformation of the refugees. And so we're going to start with asking the question of what constitutes being radical within, let's say, the Protestant fold, so to speak, writ large. So that's the first slide. Then after this introduction, what constitutes quote unquote radical? Now I have up here too the first entry, so to speak, or subpoint with trying to answer this question: what constitutes radical? Mysticism and dissent. And that actually is the title of a book by Stephen Osment. I mentioned Osment before. It is one of his earlier works and one of his better ones, but that's another whole long story. And Osment points out, not that this was not known necessarily before, that there is a very close relationship between mystical theology, which I'll talk about briefly, shortly too, mystical theology, and dissent or opposition. He certainly was not the first. Before Osment's mysticism and dissent was Michael Waltzer's the revolution or the Reformation of the Saints, or the Revolution of the Saints. I forget exactly what the title off the top of my head right now, dealing with actually basically the Puritans and Calvin's view. But mysticism is a problem, and has had always been a problem for the church, the institutional hierarchical church. Here's the problem. I'm not going to define mysticism as such. We can think of it as mystical. We can think of it as spiritual. We can think of it as an individual experience of revelation. And it's kind of all of those above, the sense that I've had a mystical experience, meaning I've seen something, something has been revealed to me that is not common out there, and on we go. I mean, we can look at the Christian tradition all along, and we can say that, Paul's experience on the road to Damascus when he was struck blind and God spoke to him, or Jesus spoke to him, that was a mystical experience. And we can say, well, did that really happen just the way it did? Maybe, maybe not. We have no way of proving that. That's part of the problem with mystical experiences, is how do we articulate them that makes some sense. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus didn't strike out to Saul and say Saul. I'm not saying that did not happen literally. but there's no way to provide evidence for it. And just because we could say it's a mystical experience, that does not preclude it also being a literal account of that mystical experience, because that would be a mystical experience, regardless, in terms of that was an individual revelation to Paul. And we could say probably Paul was not necessarily all alone on the road, but did anybody else hear it? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Who knows? Blah, but Paul heard it. Mystical experience. And we can point to all kinds of other biblical examples of mystical experiences. And within the church, the mystical experiences of the resurrected Jesus is the very foundation of Christianity. Meaning that that Christianity, in one sense, is itself a mystical religion, because it's based on a mystical experience, which again does not mean did not happen. Let me stress that. It does not mean that it did not happen literally. But the experience of the resurrection is a mystical experience, whether the resurrection actually physically occurred or not. This goes back to the distinction in one way between theology and history. History has to be based on sources, on evidence, and for the historian, we can't claim that Jesus rose from the dead physically. Coming out of the tomb, he arose, and all those fun things. The historian can't proclaim on that because there's no evidence. What we can proclaim is that many people believed it and felt that they had experienced it. That is that mystical aspect that, again, may be absolutely genuine and literal and true. But we have no way as historians to determine that. Throughout the medieval period, there were mystics going from the early church, the Desert Fathers, in some ways the martyrs, but all the way through, there were individuals who had individual revelations from God. So why is that a problem? Because on the one hand, since Christianity, as I just said, is such a mystical religion in many ways, the church, the institutionalized church, could not say, no, that is wrong. It's a problem. What do? Do you accept it? Because what if my revelation is going to the Pope and say, Holy Father, or Pope, or whatever, Jesus appeared to me and told me to tell you that you need to just resign and to do away with the papacy as such. Now, as a mystical experience, maybe that was true. Maybe that was legitimate. What's the Pope's response? Nope, I'm not going to do that. What's the evidence? I don't have any evidence, so we have to make a determination. And that was the problem all along that the hierarchy confronted, because we cannot deny the phenomenon of God's revelation to individuals, unless we say, well, God no longer does that. And that was actually one possible attitude to have, that God revealed God's self in the law and the scriptures, and thereafter does not do that anymore. The other position, which is far more the most prevalent one, is that God does continue to reveal God's self to individuals. The problem is discerning whether such a revelation that is then communicated to someone else is true or false or valid or legitimate. There began to be, especially in the later Middle Ages, and one of my Augustinians, Henry of Fremar, who was kind of the senior colleague with Jordan of Quedlinburg at Erfurt. If you remember back in the introduction to Jordan's exposition, I talk about Henry as one of the major sources for Jordan, Henry's own exposition. But Henry also wrote a treatise on discerning the spirits. It's funny, he wrote it in German, because he wrote it for parish priests. He wrote it in German, early German. Um, and the point was, how do you know? How do you discern the spirits? Whether a proclamation of revelation, of insight, is from God or is one's own uh, fantasy or hallucination, or is simply someone putting forward a position for their own benefit, for financial gain or political gain or power, or just to cause problems. It's very difficult. And Henry wrote a treatise, and there were other treatises written too, about the process of how to go about doing so. Because a mystical experience that becomes almost a prophetical um, experience. It's one thing if I, say I had a mystical experience where I saw, Jesus sitting in glory in heaven. Um, that's one thing. That's another thing if I then go on and say, and Jesus told me that this is what we need to do. So there's always this sense of, is it mystical, simply really personal, or is it mystical in terms of being directional or prophetic? And again, with prophecy, with the prophetic nature of it, Christianity is also a prophetic language. So the church cannot deny the phenomenon of prophecy based on individual revelation. That's the whole basis of the Old Testament prophets. So it can't deny it. But what do you do about it, especially if you disagree with it? Or if it's, against you, how do you handle it? That is then where the dissent comes in, because it can be an opposition to say, I have direct authority from God, because the whole issue is power and authority. If I have a direct revelation from God and it's accepted as genuine, that is the highest authority you can possibly have, because throughout medieval Christendom, who was above both the Pope and the Emperor? Christ. Both the Pope and the Emperor served for God, for Jesus God. Okay, Vicar of, Emperor used to be called the Vicar of God. And Pope started becoming called the Vicar of Christ, and the Vicar of God term fell by the wayside. Fine. But no one questioned that the true head of the church was Christ. So if you have a directive from Christ, that's the highest authority you can possibly have, and it kind of trumps the Pope and trumps everybody else. The question then is, was it legitimate? And if it's not accepted, or if it's questioned, then that becomes an issue of dissent. Because if you've had such an experience, such a mystical experience with a directive, and it's rejected, you can't say, oh, I guess I was wrong. You believe it, unless you were putting it forward for your own benefit, didn't really have the experience or believe the experience. But if you really did, you believe it. And so therefore you're in opposition. It's a matter of truth. It's a matter of authority. Just as Luther believed, not that he had a mystical experience as such, but that he had seen the truth and that he understood the truth of the Gospels and the Scriptures as no one else. And he alone was right. That was his belief. And did he believe it? Oh, yes. He believed it to the point of being willing to stand up before the Diet of Worms and say, no, I will not recant. God help me. Amen. Because he believed he was right. That belief is the basis of dissent. Now, we can talk a lot more about that. And dissent is protesting. Dissent can lead to rebellion, and dissent can lead to revolution. That's the impact of it, and how to approach it, how to deal with it, can be extremely difficult still today, because it's appealing to something that cannot be evidenced in court, so to speak. Now, in the Radical Reformation, there's an element of this mystical dissent. I'm not saying that explains the whole term radical, but there is an element of it that is rather common, that helps us to realize that a radical position is one, again, that is saying, I know the truth, but yet that was Luther's position. So, how do we distinguish a general mystical experience from a radical Reformation as a distinct form or a distinct pattern of Reformation? So, let's just briefly go through the three patterns of Reformation that I have listed here and that I'll be dealing with in my lecture. I should have added to the Catholic Reformation. Because that too is a pattern of Reformation, and I'll be talking about again next week. I guess I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about different patterns of Protestant Reformation here. And I did not add the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which I would certainly claim is also a pattern of Reformation. So that's a given. So there are at least two um, categories of patterns of Reformation that I don't have on this list. Just keep that in mind. But here I have the Magisterial Reformation, the Reformation of the Refugees, and the Radical Reformation. Now, the Radical Reformation is the topic of this lecture. The Reformation of the Refugees is what I've been talking about in the past three lectures, I think it was, dealing with Calvin and France and Geneva. Not that France was as such as part of the Reformation of the Refugees, but what came from France, Calvin's view and focus on France, and Calvin having to flee France and find refuge as a refugee in Geneva. That was the basis of Obermann's category, the Reformation of the Refugees. The Magisterial Reformation is comprised of Luther's Reformation, the Reformation within the Empire, the English Reformation, which I'll talk about again next lecture, even though that was a kind of a unique form, and basically the city Reformation. Now, I could have also put up there as another category of patterns or another pattern of Reformation, the city Reformation, the Reformation of the cities. Actually, as a footnote, Steve Osmond also wrote a book called The Reformation of the Cities. In the cities, because there's no question that, especially early on with Luther, the imperial cities, the free imperial cities, were the kind of the nexus of which the Reformation spread, of which Luther's Reformation spread. Now, why I don't list it here as a separate pattern is because what we're talking about here is not just in the city, but actions of the city council. A magisterial refers to the magistrates. The magistrates are those, let's say, politicians, those in charge, those in political office that dictate and implement policy. The emperor is a magistrate. A duke is a magistrate. A city council is a magistrate. So that's why I would say that this Reformation of the cities, or the city Reformation, is part of this magisterial Reformation, insofar as it was the city Reformation. It was the city councils that introduced Reformation. That was the way it was in Zurich with Zwingli. And even though Zwingli is different from Luther that we've talked about, and was very important as an individual, just as Luther was, it was the city council who affected and brought about the Reformation, just as it was in Geneva. Geneva was magisterial, even though it was conducted by and under the influence of the refugee, John Calvin. That is a mixed bag there. But then, Luther, what was the catalyst, we can say, of the Reformation movement in the empire, but he was supported by Frederick the Wise. And if he hadn't been, if Frederick was a magistrate, and if other princes had not followed along, what would have happened? So this magisterial Reformation, let's say, is Reformation from above, by the powers that be, so to speak, the official judicial administrative organs of government, implementing and imposing Reformation. That is kind of the magisterial Reformation that we talk about. The Reformation of the refugees, I've already discussed with Calvin, and so that also then has impact in England with French refugees going to England and having an impact in England who fled. Now, in some ways, we could see the Radical Reformation fitting into the Reformation of the refugees, because as we'll be talking about shortly, the Radical Reformation, or the radicals, let's say, were refugees from everyone, basically. They had no place, but I'll be getting that to that in a second. And then that's the Radical Reformation. Here's the third. So, which I'll be filling out today, I hope. So those are the three categories or patterns of Reformation that we've been dealing with. I omitted the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which I should have put on there because I definitely would argue that that is as much a pattern as any of the others. And then would also need to add to that list the Catholic or Counter Reformation. So there'd be 5 patterns of Reformation. Essentially, those are the 5 that I'll be hoping that you'll be dealing with um, in the discussion, and we'll use as a primary base for your final essay in terms of the extent to which the Reformation was a revolution. Because we certainly can say in some ways it was, in other ways it wasn't, how so, where so, and those kinds of aspects. Or we can say the whole Protestant movement in opposition to the established hierarchy, um, within then also theological opposition within a political context and a political base, constituted revolution. We could say that. But anyway, that is for you to determine. As I said, there's no right or wrong answer. We'll be talking more about the final as we go along. But one of the characteristics of the Radical Reformation that is more or less basically common to all that fit within that category that Williams talks about was the lack of a political base. Luther was based in electoral Saxony. Calvin became based in Geneva. Obviously, Zurich was a city-state itself, and so they had that political base for the city council. By definition, almost would have a city base. But the radicals didn't have one. Now, we're talking about some of the different forms of the Radical Reformation in a minute or two or three or four or five or 10 or 20. And you'll say, well, wait a minute. That certainly looks like a political base to me. Yes, but only in part. And we'll get there, and I'll try to come back to that point. For example, and I'll come back to this on the next slide. Munster, the so-called Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster, certainly was political and certainly had a base in Munster, but did not have a base in terms of the empire or even the region and the local prince. Because, again, it wasn't led by a magistrate. We'll get there. So that's one characteristic, is lacking a political base, which means then two, whereas the magisterial Reformation was, we could say, is Reformation from above, the Radical Reformation was very much a Reformation from below, from the people themselves. Certainly not spontaneously from the people, certainly based on leaders going and preaching and gaining support from the people. But it was kind of Reformation from below rather than the magisterial Reformation from above. Now, then, we have the theological positions that are, again, not uniformly there in every individual figure movement that has been labeled radical or part of the Radical Reformation. But in general, there is a general consensus that all these different groups, even as widely divergent as they were, shared some basic theological principles, part of that theological dissent, theological critique. And there I have mysticism. Now, I've already spoken a fair amount about mysticism and dissent. All of the radical positions has an element of that, based on an individual revelation, an individual insight. So, yeah, but Luther did too. Yes, but still, but when you have that without the political structure to support it, it then just becomes an individual insight and revelation. So that mystical aspect could also then manifest itself in various different ways, and we'll see that when we talk about some of the basic, some of the different forms of Radical Reformation shortly. And then the issue of baptism. This is a difficult one because in the 16th century, as again I'll be talking about shortly, there began to be individuals that were gaining support that advocated for only adult baptism. The baptism was not for infants. Baptism was not about removing the stain of original sin, but baptism was the adult decision to join the community. I mean, the traditional view is, of course, baptism is about joining the community, being part of the community. And with the chrism, at baptism, the baby is marked as one of Christ, as one of ours within the church. So that was kind of the basis of the first part of the membership right there. But for a lot of these radicals, it's like that can't be because a baby cannot make a conscious decision. Only an adult can, the age of accountability, as we would say. And so it's only then that we will baptize someone as an initiation rite into the community. Now, this goes all the way back to, in some ways, to the Donatist controversy in the late 4th, 5th century, and the opposition to it, led by Augustine. I'm not going to go discuss that. If you don't know about the Donatist controversy, just let me know, and I can tell you about it. I can give you things to read. I can send you lectures that in which I've have written up that I've addressed it probably at length. But the issue is no one ever, none of these people ever claimed that they were going to rebaptize someone. They were accused of rebaptizing someone. The point was, what was valid baptism? And for the radicals, who in general advocated adult baptism, the idea was if you were baptized as an infant, you were not baptized. Therefore, we are going to baptize you. You need to be baptized. It was not a rebaptism. But for the everyone else, it was rebaptism, which was blasphemous because it denied God's actions. That was the case with the Donatists and Augustine. And it became an issue. Not that all were Donatistic, but the issue of the baptism resurfaced then in the 16th century. The question had been settled for 1,200 years? No, 1,100 years. But then it resurfaces, and it was based on individuals reading the Bible for themselves, thinking that they could interpret the Bible for themselves, and saying, wait a minute, there's no baptism in the scriptures. The baptisms that are discussed in the scriptures are all adults. John the Baptist, baptizing Jesus in the Jordan. Also, his mission baptizing for repentance, calling for repentance, as remission of sins, and baptism as a symbol thereof. And so the dilemma was, if that's the case, what's the scriptural foundation for infant baptism? Now, the tradition had dealt with that for a long time. That was, as I kind of said, a closed question for about 1,100 years when it resurfaces. But those who were advocates for infant baptism, which included the Magisterial Reformation and the Reformation of the Refugees, and the English Reformation that we're talking about, and the Catholic Reformation, all the other forms of or patterns of Reformation, were advocates of infant baptism. But the radicals were saying, no, it has to be adult baptism. Now, again, they claimed that's the only legitimate baptism. And so if you were baptized beforehand, as I just got through saying, you were not baptized. So there's no such thing as rebaptism. But yet, for everybody else, to claim that infant baptism was not valid, that meant that they were rebaptizing. And that was blasphemous. And blasphemy was even worse than idolatry and heresy, even though idolatry was also blasphemy in that sense. And heresy was too, in some ways. But it's denying God's actions, it's denying God's grace. And it was about as abhorrent to everyone else as it could be. And Catholics and Protestants both joined together to try to exterminate what they called Anabaptists. And Anabaptists just meant rebaptizers. So they were always in danger. Doesn't mean that they had a concerted effort going out and hunting them down like they did with the peasants. With the Peasants' War, the Catholics and Protestants could both agree, rebellious peasants is absolutely wrong. Both Catholics and Protestants could agree that Anabaptism, that rebaptism, was absolutely wrong and had to be exterminated. But whereas the Peasants' War was a very open conflict, the Anabaptists, or let's just even say the Baptists, as they later became to be known, the whole various widespread tradition of the Baptists in this country all come basically from this Anabaptist movement. I just say Anabaptist because that's just the traditional historiographical term. It's not a term that they use for themselves. It was used historically to critique them, to damn them as Anabaptists, those who are baptizing again. Now, that was a common thing. Now, another component to the Radical Reformation, or at least some factions, and this certainly was by no means common. Mysticism and baptism was pretty common theological positions amongst all forms or groups within the category of the Radical Reformation. But this next one was very specific, and that is anti-Trinitarianism. The Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, had been problematic all along. Been worked out, the Trinitarian theology had been worked out in the early church. And not to say that there wasn't continued work on it, or discussion of it, or treatises written on it. There certainly was, because it still had to be taught. How do we understand it? Because isn't this worshiping three gods? It's like, no, God is no. We don't worship three gods. We worship one God. But how do we understand that? Oh, three persons or manifestations or hypostases or different other terms that are used to try to explain the mystery of the Trinity. But it's still an issue. Wait, these are still three distinct things, are they not? Isn't God the Father not the same as God the Son? And every Christian theologian, every good Trinitarian theologian would say absolutely God the Father is not the same as God the Son or God the Holy Spirit. But there's only one God. It is a problem, period. And so in the 16th century, there were groups that started saying, you know what? That's paganism. We need to go back to a Jewish understanding of the unicity of God. There's only one God. You shall only have one God and no other gods before me. Denying the Trinity does not mean that they denied Christ. Did not mean that they denied the incarnation as such. But they denied the Trinitarian Godhead. There was just a single God. They too could have gotten themselves into a lot of trouble and did, because that's pretty basic as well. And yet they were far less politically motivated, let's say. They were far less out there trying to convert others, so to speak, except for, as I mentioned last week lectures, Michael Servetus, who was an anti-Trinitarian, thought he could convince Calvin. And I already discussed what happened to him. Whereas Calvin thought he should be beheaded, but the city council said, no, he's going to be burned as everybody else. And he was, because that you can't, at the time, you could not be an anti-Trinitarian and still be considered a Christian. Moreover, that tradition that began then with the Radical Reformation of anti-Trinitarianism is prevalent still today in what's called the Unitarians. The Unitarians are anti-Trinitarian. And that too was had an impact within colonial U.S. in terms of Unitarianism being a major factor, one of the religious options, so to speak, in some of the colonies. And so the issue of, let's say, benign, not acceptance, but toleration of it came about much later, certainly not in the 16th century. So that's, I said, there was not widespread, but one faction within the Radical Reformation was anti-Trinitarianism. Another, also the same way, not completely uniform and common to all, but more general than anti-Trinitarianism, was a millennial apocalyptic. I've talked about apocalypticism, I think, before. A millennial apocalyptic, the millennium is 1,000 years, was the position of we have to initiate the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ before the end of the world. That's a whole debate with millennialism. Is it the 1,000 reign? Is it when the Antichrist will reign for 1,000 years and then be locked up again? Or is it Jesus will reign for 1,000 years and then the end of the world? So it becomes very contentious over terms of what that really means. But there's a millennium, there's a 1,000-year period coming from Revelation that theologians have to deal with. And this one position was that we know is coming. The millennium is upon us. We have to bring it about to establish Christ's reign on earth. And for that, that's based on a revelation. That's based on a mystical experience. And so that is there. Now, those just very quickly are 4 theological positions from the most common, namely mysticism and baptism, to the most particular, anti-Trinitarianism. And then millennial apocalyptic is kind of in between. Say mysticism and baptism is almost, I'm not going to say uniformly, but is in general characteristics of what constitutes being a radical reformer, part of the Radical Reformation, whereas anti-Trinitarianism is a particular form thereof, and the millennial apocalyptic is common but not general. Also, though, part of the Radical Reformation. So, I know that was still, I'm taking far more time than I thought this was going to take. I thought this was going to be a relatively short lecture. Anyway, I hope that kind of gives you at least some access to the concept, to the term, to understand what was going on, and now to move on to look at some of the different forms of Radical Reformation. And again, this is going to be a selection of some of the major forms. It's not dealing with all the groups that Williams deals with in his magisterial book, the Reformation, the Radical Reformation, but it's looking at some of the major players and figures and events that fall into the category of Radical Reformation in the 16th century. And there are different forms. Okay, so given that, we then look here to the forms of Radical Reformation. The first issue, one there I give is individual. Now, individual, I just talked about mysticism and mystical experiences, and here we have the example of what were known at the time as the Zwickau prophets. Now, this Zwickau is a city in northeastern Germany, kind of near the border with what used to be Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic today. And there were, I believe, 3 individuals in Zwickau who had been, visiting Zurich, had interactions with Zwingli, also then went to Zurich to try to convince Zwingli. They believed that they had a revelation, a divine revelation themselves that they were trying to convince other people of, and part of that was doing away with infant baptism. There's no evidence that they actually practiced adult baptism or rebaptism, but that will come back in a couple points with Swiss Anabaptism and Conrad Grebel. But they were advocating for it. They were advocating against a literal understanding of the words of the institution, advocating for getting rid of the German of the Mass, for speaking, having worship done in the vernacular. Pretty radical, and they tried to persuade Zwingli. Zwingli was a little bit influenced by them. Then they went to Wittenberg. But they arrived in Wittenberg as Luther was still in the Wartburg. So Melanchthon had to deal with him, and he wasn't sure. And he writes to Luther, and Luther says, how do I know if what they're saying is true or valid or not? And Luther said, test the spirits. The same approach that Henry of Freimar had given in his treatise, testing the spirits, or actually investigating the spirits, Untersuchungen der Geist, or investigations of the spirit. And so they were not accepted in Wittenberg, and they just kind of left and were dispersed and went back to Zurich, went back to Zwickau, had a small following by, say, individual there, not because they did not have some followers, but because it was based on this individual insight, this individual mystical insight. Now that too was common with others as well, but that's one form, this prophetic form. I could also have called it the prophetic form, but that too was not unique to the Zwickau prophets. Other individuals, other movements were also prophetic in that sense. The second form, then, I term here communal. That too is something that every form of radical Reformation certainly was communal. But what I mean by that, we have individual radicalization based on mysticism to a communal approach of the community has to stick together. And here I have Brother Andrew, which is going back to Andrew Karlstadt, whom I talked about with the Wittenberg movement in 1522, trying to take over the lead when Luther was in the Wartburg. And then Luther comes back and humiliates him once again, and he flees. He's the one who was the first one to celebrate a so-called evangelical mass in Christmas of 1521, not in his vestments, giving communion in both kinds to everyone. And Luther comes back and says, no, this is going too far. It's not necessarily even that it's wrong, it's just going too far too quickly. And that was one of the issues, too, that became an issue for all the radical reformers and things, the issue between what is allowed and what should be forced. And the radicals were all for forcing the issue, at least within their own community. This is not an option. You have to believe this and follow this. Now that gets very tricky too, because Luther was not certainly saying, well, there are various options. You can believe what you will. He was not saying that whatsoever. He too was trying to force people to believe what he was putting forward as the truth. But he thought, we need to be patient. We need to be willing to understand that these are radical changes. Yes, we can't say all Protestantism was a radical Reformation. Radical changes, and people need to have time to understand what's behind them, understand the reasons for them. Now, Karlstadt, again, became kind of a leader of a community in Orlamünde, another German city. And he is seen in some ways as one of the founders of the Radical Reformation, having rejected Luther and what was going on within electoral Saxony, certainly not within he didn't lead the empire, but that political-based Reformation from above approach that we see with Luther and Friedrich the Wise in opposition to Charles V. But for Andrew, it was very much coming from below. Ministering to the people, preaching to the people, trying to get them to come along and understand that we need to meet the people where they are, rather than to try to force something down their throats. So that's this kind of communal aspect. Now, again, as I said, it's not unique to Karlstadt. And every form of the Radical Reformation I'll be addressing here has some aspect of that communal nature within it, just as they do of that individual mystical experience. But then we have, let's coming to the Anabaptism, the Swiss Anabaptism, and Conrad Grebel. Conrad Grebel was an educated man, and he came to the position that baptism had to be adult baptism. He was working in Zurich. He was in conversations with Zwingli. Zwingli wasn't really going that radical, and did not agree with Grebel. Grebel ended up then being the first one to perform adult baptism on someone who had been baptized already, which, of course, as I argued, Grebel didn't consider to have been a valid baptism. So his point was, I'm going to baptize you because we haven't been baptized. And then he was baptized and went. And that was the beginnings of Anabaptism in Switzerland in the context of the Reformation within Zurich, which is part, as I argue, part of the Magisterial Reformation, or Reformation of the city-states, the cities, led by Zwingli in that case. They broke from that. They said, no, theologically, we're not going to do that. And they became outcasts, even though they started having followers. There began to be Anabaptist communities throughout southwest Germany, and there were active attempts to get rid of them and extinguish them. There's a whole series of volumes, published documents called the Täuferakten, the acts against the Anabaptists, against the Baptists. Taufen is to baptize. Täufer is baptizers or Baptists. And acts against them. So there are trial records. There are attempts to try to exterminate them and find out where they're from. Try to get them to recant and those kinds of things. And so it wasn't turning a blind eye to it when I said they weren't as systematically going after the Anabaptists as they did the peasants in terms of the Peasants' War. They certainly were aware of the problem and sought to root it out and exterminate it. Okay, so that was the Swiss as it was beginning to catch on. Then we have the militant form. And here I talk about Munster. Munster is kind of in southwest Germany. Oh, no, excuse me, northwest Germany. And here I have the figures Melchior Hoffman, Jan Matthijs, and Jan of Leyden, and the Anabaptist Kingdom. It's called the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. And really, Melchior Hoffman was not simply in Munster, but he was certainly influential, particularly with Jan Matthijs and Jan of Leyden, were the real leaders of this Anabaptist community who tried to take over Munster and did. They were proclaiming the kingdom of God had arrived in Munster in 1534. They kind of had established themselves. They also, Matthias had been captured and put to death. But Leyden then continued the movement as king of Munster, the kingdom of Munster. Munster's a city, so it's not. So all of a sudden there was this militant political opposition. And here I said, there was a political base. They had a city, and they held a city for a couple of years. Jan of Leyden also, in his interpretation of the scriptures, said, what we need to do? We need to produce more of us. In the Old Testament, the patriarchs had multiple wives. We are going to institute polygamy here. So this kingdom was based then on polygamy, where we would have multiple wives. Individual males would have multiple wives to produce as many children as possible. New good Anabaptists then subjects of the kingdom of Munster, the Anabaptist kingdom of Munster, and especially with polygamy, which itself is a long story in a minute. That was pretty repulsive at the time too. And here, kind of like the Peasant War, was an open, clear opposition, and forces went to stamp it out, and they did. They wiped it out. They executed Jan of Leyden. and they got rid of the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster in 1534. But the point was that the position of Jan of Leiden and Jan Matthias was a militancy. We need to take up arms, defend ourselves. We need to bring about the kingdom of God. We need to be the soldiers that fight for it. Now, again, not all the Swiss Anabaptists, Conrad Grebel, and so were not militant in that form whatsoever. Certainly, Karlstadt and Orlamünde wasn't either. That doesn't mean they were pacifists, but they weren't openly militant like the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. Then there was the pacifist form. We have up there Menno Simons and Dutch Anabaptism, and this was a form that was centered in the Netherlands and stemmed from the influence of Menno Simons, who also had been very educated. He became kind of converted to Anabaptism, which I'm using the outgroup term, but to adult baptism, and the need to then baptize individuals who had thought they had been baptized as infants, but we'll have to baptize them again, not again, but for the first time because the first wasn't valid. And he was a complete pacifist. He argued very much that, based on the Sermon on the Mount, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him your left, or the left and right, I forget which side is the first, and do not resist. Pray for your enemies, love your enemies. We should be peaceful and pacifist, and we should kind of live within ourselves. And from this movement and the influence of Menno Simons, we still have today groups known as the Mennonites. The Mennonites named after Menno Simons, and they too today are pacifists. And so that too is one part of the impact of this form of radical Reformation. Now, when we look at the effects of the radical Reformation, what do we see? Not only at the time, but let's say their impact later on in history on until today. One is opposition and resistance. They were radical. They all were radical because they opposed the established norms of the communities in which they found themselves. The established norms, whether it be the traditional Roman hierarchy and doctrine, or the emerging Protestant magisterial reforms. They oppose them, even if passively as pacifists, or openly as militants, or somewhere in between. And they resisted conforming. In some ways, we could put this all into the sense of the radical reformations were all nonconformists. I'll get to that in the last thing. Another aspect of the radical reformation was that all of these groups suffered persecution. They were not accepted. They were not allowed to freely exist. They were sought to be exterminated and hunted out because they were wrong. Yeah, I'm not saying yes, and they were wrong. I'm saying that's how they were seen by the establishments. The establishments here, I'm talking about the magisterial Reformation, the Reformation of the magistrates, those in political authority. The Radical Reformation lacked the political authority. So that tradition, though, of feeling persecuted is still there. You say, well, isn't that the same as the Reformation of the refugees? And to that extent, yes. But the Reformation of the refugees, as I argued in the past 3 lectures, was very different from the Radical Reformation, even though there are some similarities in some of these general terms I'm using. Another common element was individual and mystical, this idea that God still is revealing God's self to individuals, and we need to listen to God's revelation, to follow it. We have mystical experiences, and in some ways, even though there's not a direct line, and there's not a direct line, but we can see the impact of this aspect of the Radical Reformation and the emergence of Pentecostalism in the early 20th century in this country. So I'm not saying that there was, again, there's not a direct line, even though there could be a direct line from the Anabaptist to the Baptist traditions, even as it diffuses and disperses all over the place. But there was a direct line to that, certainly with the Lutherans, certainly with the Anglicans, as we'll talk about next week, certainly with the Calvinists. With the issue of this individual mysticism and Pentecostalism, there was no direct line. It's just similarities that are still kind of with us in that sense. And then theological and political nonconformity. Someone was deemed a radical or could have been seen as a radical because they weren't like everybody else. They weren't conforming to the standards and norms within the region of the established power and authority. They refused to conform to what they were told, both theologically, in terms of baptism, in terms of the emphasis on individual and mystical experiences, in terms of either pacifism or militancy, because in that sense, both were those were extremes. Both Jan of Leiden in the Kingdom of Munster was one extreme, and Menno Simons was the other extreme in terms of being a pacifist. Menno Simons was not, rooted out and executed. If you're a pacifist, you can kind of hide pretty easily and go, be kind of quiet about things. But that's still then today in terms of opposition and nonconformity, because only the powers that be, going back to the view of Romans 13, powers that be are ordained of God, and if you do not conform with those, you are not following God's law. That was the position and view of the magisterial Reformation. We are administrators for God. We are the powers that be, and it's our responsibility to ensure proper theology, proper religious practice, and we're the ones responsible for that because we are empowered and directed by God to do so. And if you are opposing us, you obviously are not on God's side. Now, that nonconformity and goes back to opposition and resistance, both politically and theologically. And in that sense, they are radicals because they did not conform with the norms. You say, well, Calvin didn't conform to the norms. No, he didn't. But he is establishing norms. Luther didn't conform to the norms, but he established new norms. And I'm not saying that there weren't norms within some of the radical Reformation communities and so, but it's in some ways more of the majority in the region. You're different. You're not one of us. That's the problem. There's still a problem we have. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the lack of uniformity? How do we deal with, quote unquote, the other? Those who are not like us, those who are not us, without realizing that for every individual, every other individual is the other. We forget that. And we start seeing ourselves as part of a group. People who are like us are one group, and if you're not, you're the other. And the other is dangerous because it's an implicit critique against us. The radical reformers, the radical Reformation was all an implicit, sometimes extremely explicit critique of the powers that be, whether it be the Lutherans or Zwingli and the Reformed, or Calvin and the French, and the Swiss in that sense, or the English. They were implicitly and sometimes explicitly in opposition and defiance. Mysticism and dissent is still with us. How do we handle it? How do we handle individual insight, revelation, individual rights within a larger group, when those insights and rights are seen by the group to conflict. That's the problem with the Radical Reformation. That's why it's termed radical. They're nonconformists to the status quo of the given powers that be. Now, as a pattern of Reformation, it's difficult to say that there's any one thing that comprised the Radical Reformation. It's very disparate, consisting of all the nonconformists, but that as such was a pattern of Reformation that was of major significance for the developments in the 16th century and far beyond still today. Thank you very much.